The war had ended, but the battlefield didn't feel like victory. It felt like a graveyard of broken machines and forgotten promises. Thick gray smoke still drifted across the charred alien landscape of Varnak 7, where bodies of both humans and non-humans lay scattered in the mud and ash, many unrecognizable from the brutal final push against the machine swarm. Corporal James Keller moved cautiously between shattered vehicles and scorched terrain, the only sound coming from the distant crackle of melting metal and the wind whispering through ruins. He was supposed to regroup with the evacuation team at the ridge, but something made him stay behind a little longer. He had seen too many soldiers left behind in previous missions, too many names reduced to static in the records. As he stepped over a fallen sentry drone, a faint sound, barely a gasp, reached his ears. James froze. It was mechanical. It was alive. Following the sound, he moved a pile of burned debris and came face to face with a Teloran warrior, an alien known across the galaxy for their strength, pride, and unshakable loyalty to their own. The creature's shimmering armor was cracked, his body pinned by twisted metal, and his legs didn't move at all. James instantly recognized the rank insignia on the warrior's chest. It was General Circle, one of the most respected Teloran commanders, feared by enemies, respected by allies, and yet, now, reduced to breathing through pain, unable to lift even a hand. James looked around and called out for help on the comms, reporting a living non-human casualty and requesting a stretcher team. The reply came back cold: Teloran aren't priority. Leave him and return. His throat tightened. The coalition had always worked together, but everyone knew the cracks beneath the surface. Some humans still believed the aliens were temporary allies, tools, not equals. James knew better. Months ago, Circle's forces had saved his unit from being completely wiped out during a surprise ambush. The alien had fought with honor and had even stayed behind to cover their retreat. James hadn't forgotten. Now, no one else would lift a finger for him. Alone in a field of silence and betrayal, James made a decision that would change his life. He knelt beside the alien, checking his wounds, internal bleeding, crushed spine, cracked ribs, but the heart was still strong. The general's eyes fluttered open and locked onto James's face. There was no fear, no plea for help, only silent acceptance, as if he had already guessed the others would walk past him. "I've got you," James whispered, more to himself than the alien. He removed his pack, fashioned straps, and began building a makeshift stretcher using armor plates and support rods from a broken walker nearby. His hands moved fast, but his heart pounded louder with every second. He knew that staying any longer meant defying orders, possibly even facing a military tribunal later. But what kind of soldier abandons someone they could save no matter what species they are? As he lifted Circle onto the stretcher, the alien winced in pain but didn't cry out. He was still proud, even half-broken. James started dragging him across the uneven terrain, step by step, past wrecked tanks, over fallen trees, and through pools of oil and blood. The weight was crushing, but he didn't stop. He thought of his brother, Mark, who died in the early days of the war, not because the enemy was stronger, but because no one came when he called for help. James had promised himself he wouldn't let that happen again. Over the comms, the voices of his fellow soldiers came through, mocking him, telling him he was wasting his time, saying the alien would have left him to die. James didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was in his actions. Hours passed. The smoke began to clear, and the eerie silence of the battlefield returned. But James's struggle was just beginning. He paused to rest behind the remains of a downed gunship, wiping the sweat and dirt from his brow. Circle looked at him and tried to speak, his voice a low growl. James leaned in. The alien said only 2 words in broken English. "Why you?" James didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain that something deep inside him refused to let another soul be left behind. He simply replied, "Because it's the right thing." Just then, a low beep came from his wrist unit motion detected ahead. James quickly ducked and covered the alien's body with a camouflage net. A Coalition patrol drone hovered nearby, scanning for movement. If it saw him helping a non-human, it might report him for insubordination. He held his breath, heart racing, until the drone passed overhead and moved on. He exhaled slowly. The danger was growing, but so was his resolve. He would not stop until Circle was safe. As night began to fall, James spotted a collapsed tunnel that could offer shelter until dawn. He pulled the stretcher toward it, pushing through exhaustion, his legs burning with every step. The entrance was narrow, filled with rubble, but it was better than being out in the open. He dragged Circle inside, covered the opening with broken panels, and sat beside the alien in the dark. The air was cold and heavy with dust, but James felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, he felt like a soldier again, not a pawn in someone else's war, but a man making his own stand. As Circle drifted into a restless sleep, James leaned against the wall, gripping his rifle, watching the shadows, and preparing for whatever came next. Outside, the silence of the battlefield lingered, but deep within that silence, something had already begun to shift, a bond forged in the ashes of war, between 2 enemies who chose, in that moment, not to be enemies at all. James Keller didn't sleep that night. His back pressed against the cold wall of the collapsed tunnel, and the soft, uneven breathing of the wounded alien warrior beside him was the only sound that reminded him he was still alive. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked toward the narrow entrance, watching for patrol drones or enemy stragglers that might have survived the battle. The tunnel was dark, tight, and smelled of metal dust and scorched carbon. Still, it was the safest place he could find after dragging a paralyzed T-Loron general across half a mile of wreckage. Morning came slowly on Varnak 7, the blood-orange sky shifting above the dead battlefield. James's muscles ached from the effort, but the moment the sky began to brighten, he was back on his feet. His mission was now clear: get Circle to safety, no matter what. But the real danger wasn't just the landscape. It was his own side. The Coalition High Command had already given the order to abandon non-human casualties. No one wanted diplomatic tension, they wanted a quick exit, a clean win. Helping Circle meant going directly against military orders, and if caught, James could be discharged, imprisoned, or worse. Still, every time he looked at the wounded alien, he remembered how Circle had fought side by side with human troops, never retreating, never hesitating. That memory was louder than any order in James's ears. He used his combat knife to slice apart old wiring and fuse it into makeshift braces for the alien's shattered legs, hoping to prevent further injury during movement. Circle's eyes occasionally fluttered open, still full of pride, still not asking for pity. James packed a few emergency rations into his pouch and shared water with the alien, placing the canteen against his lips gently. The general drank slowly, his sharp eyes never breaking contact with James, as if trying to understand the reason behind this defiance of protocol. James didn't explain. He just worked silently, knowing that words meant little now. Outside the tunnel, James climbed a slope to survey the area. Smoke still curled from the ruins, and in the far distance, He saw the faint shimmer of Coalition dropships preparing to lift off from the extraction point. Time was running out. He had to get Circle there without being seen or worse, stopped. He tapped into the comms network using an encrypted backdoor channel, one he had learned during a forgotten training session, and downloaded a terrain map. It showed a maintenance tunnel that led beneath the battlefield to the base perimeter. If they could make it through, they'd avoid the patrols and reach a safe zone. But it was a narrow path, filled with unstable ground and old war traps that hadn't been cleared since the early campaigns. No one used that route anymore because it was considered suicide. Dragging the stretcher back onto open ground, James began the slow crawl toward the entrance of the underground tunnel. He stuck to the shadows, moved behind fallen wrecks, and paused every time he heard a mechanical whir in the air. Once, a reconnaissance drone hovered directly above him, scanning for signs of movement. He froze, lying flat with his body over Circle, heart pounding as the red light passed inches from his helmet. But the drone moved on. Breathing deeply, James pressed forward. The closer they got to the tunnel, the more dangerous it became. Scavenger bots had returned to the field, picking through remains, sometimes finishing off the dying. James had to shoot one silently when it got too close, dragging it into a pit and covering it with a steel panel. Circle stirred at the noise, his hand twitching slightly, perhaps from reflex, perhaps from pain, but still he remained silent. At last, they reached the mouth of the underground route, a rusted steel hatch half buried beneath broken crates and vines. James pried it open with effort and lowered the stretcher inside, climbing down after. The air was damp and cold, filled with echoes. The tunnel walls were covered in old graffiti from soldiers' long-gone names, jokes, and threats left during darker days. Inside, the silence grew thicker, broken only by the distant rumble of collapsing metal. James kept moving, flashlight mounted on his shoulder, illuminating the narrow corridor ahead. Rats real or mechanical skittered in the shadows. At one point, a tremor shook the ground, sending a loose panel crashing behind them. James froze again, rifle raised. No enemy followed. Just the ghosts of war. As he pulled the stretcher through a broken service door, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Footsteps, soft but quick, coming from the far end of the corridor. Coalition troops. Enemy survivors. He turned off his light and pressed himself against the wall, covering Circle once again. Then he saw them. 2 human soldiers, scouts by their uniforms, scanning the area ahead. James didn't recognize them. They weren't from his unit. They were whispering, laughing even, mentioning how High Command had left the lizard generals to rot, clearly referring to the T-Loran. James's fist clenched. These weren't allies now, they were obstacles. He waited for them to pass, holding his breath, and when they did, he didn't hesitate. He moved silently in the other direction, deeper into the maintenance route, choosing the longer path over confrontation. Hours passed. The tunnel grew tighter, more unstable. At one point, the roof collapsed behind them, sealing the way back. James didn't look back. He had no intention of returning. He kept going until they reached a sealed pressure door with rusted controls. The system was dead, but James had explosive small charges meant for breaching rooms. He set one on the lock, shielded Circle with his body, and triggered it. The blast echoed like thunder, but the door gave way. On the other side was daylight, faint, but real. They were close. A few hundred meters ahead was the outer fence of the Coalition base. Past that, safety or prison. He didn't know anymore. He just knew he couldn't stop now. As he pulled Circle into the open, alarms began to blare from the base. The explosion had triggered sensors. Soldiers were already moving. James raised both hands and called out, dragging the stretcher into view, shouting that he had a wounded ally, a coalition-friendly T-Loron commander. The guards hesitated, weapons raised, uncertain. Behind them, a senior officer appeared, frowning as he took in the sight. He barked an order for medics, but then glared at James with cold disapproval. "You disobeyed direct orders, Corporal," he said, voice flat. "You risked the entire operation for one alien." James didn't blink. "I saved a warrior who didn't deserve to die alone," he replied. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That's not your decision to make." James stared him down, heart pounding. Around them, the medics worked quickly, assessing Circle, shocked to find him alive. Whispers spread. Some soldiers stared in awe, some in disbelief. But James didn't care what they thought. He had crossed a line against the protocol and there was no turning back. As the T-Loron general was lifted onto a proper stretcher and taken into the base, James stood alone, uncertain of what came next. He was no longer just a soldier following orders. He had become something else. And the consequences of that choice were only beginning. The bright lights of the coalition base burned into Circle's sensitive eyes as he lay motionless on the medical table, his body surrounded by unfamiliar human machines and whispers that didn't sound like care, but doubt. The T-Loron general couldn't speak yet. His throat was damaged, his spine fractured, and his lower limbs refused to respond, but his mind was fully awake, sharp as ever, and burning with thoughts. Around him, the human medics moved quickly but hesitantly, as if unsure whether saving him was the right thing to do. Some looked down at him with pity, others with cold indifference, and only one voice stood out among the murmurs, the human soldier who had carried him through death's shadow. James Keller refused to leave Circle's side, standing tall while officers barked orders and questioned his sanity for what he had done. He had gone against the command, broken military law, and now stood with a heavy risk over his career, maybe even his life. But James didn't flinch. He watched over the paralyzed warrior like a brother, not a prisoner. And when the high-ranking coalition officials entered the medical wing to review the alien, their faces twisted with confusion and anger. "Why?" one of them demanded. "Why waste resources on something that can't even walk anymore?" James clenched his fists but held his ground. He answered clearly, "Because his fight isn't over." Those words stayed in Circle's head like fire. He couldn't understand why a human, especially one who had no reason to trust or protect him, would speak such words with conviction. In his culture, weakness meant isolation. Warriors who could no longer fight were honored, yes, but never expected to return to the front. And yet, this human treated him not as a fallen relic, but as a comrade whose value hadn't ended with a broken body. Days passed slowly. Machines breathed for Circle. Tubes pumped medicine through his veins. The war outside continued, but in this quiet room, a different battle was taking place. Surgeons tried experimental techniques to repair his spinal damage. There was talk of cybernetic enhancements, but most doctors said it was pointless. His body was failing, and he should be placed in permanent stasis. James didn't accept that. He spent hours researching alien biology, consulting secret records, even hacking into the Coalition's medical archives to find any chance of recovery. He spoke to Circle constantly, reading news from the front lines, talking about old battles, and keeping the general's mind awake and engaged. Though Circle couldn't move, couldn't speak, His eyes began to glow with something more than life, they glowed with purpose. Then came the hearing. James was brought before a military tribunal for insubordination. He stood in full uniform, with dried blood on his boots and a firm voice in his throat. The officers accused him of compromising military security, risking a diplomatic incident, and disobeying direct evacuation orders. But James looked them in the eye and told them everything. How Sir Call had saved dozens of human lives during joint missions. How he had stayed behind when others ran. How he had taken the blast meant for James himself. "You can call me a traitor," James said, "but I didn't leave a soldier behind." The room fell silent. For a moment, it looked like he had reached them. But then, the verdict came. Officially, James wasn't discharged, but he was suspended from field duty indefinitely. Stripped of command. A quiet punishment meant to avoid headlines. He returned to the medbay in silence, expecting Sir Call to still be unconscious. But when he entered, he found the alien's fingers twitching for the first time. It was weak, almost invisible, but real. Sir Call was fighting to return. The weeks that followed were a slow war against biology. With James's help, Sir Call began a rehabilitation program designed for human soldiers, adapted for Lorraine physiology by trial and error. It was painful, brutal. Some days, Sir Call screamed without sound, his jaw locked and his body trembling as machines tried to wake nerves that had gone cold. But he never stopped. James watched, encouraged, held him steady when needed. Together, they pushed past every limit. Sir Call learned to use his upper limbs again. Then came the moment when he managed to sit upright, his frame trembling, but his pride burning like a furnace. That day, James smuggled in a combat medal and placed it on the table beside him. "You earned this more than any of us," he said quietly. Sir Call didn't respond with words, but his eyes locked onto James's hand and didn't look away. The unspoken bond between them had grown stronger than any battle oath. But outside their room, shadows gathered. Word had spread across the coalition and the Lorraine alliance. Some praised James's actions, calling him a hero. Others warned that helping a crippled alien general was a sign of weakness. Whispers reached political ears, and pressure built to remove Sir Call from the facility altogether. Rumors even spoke of an accidental death being arranged. James knew they were being watched. One night, he caught a soldier sneaking near the medbay door with a vial in his hand, poison meant to end the story before it caused more trouble. James disarmed him without a sound and reported nothing. He knew now this wasn't just about recovery, it was survival. They had to move. With the help of a sympathetic doctor and a few of James's old allies, they planned a secret transfer to a hidden facility in the outer rings, where Sir Call could continue recovering away from political eyes. It was a long shot, but they had no choice. Before leaving, James stood by Sir Call's side and asked a simple question. "Are you ready?" Sir Call, still unable to speak, raised one hand slowly and clenched it into a fist. They left that night under the cover of a cargo transport, traveling through smuggler lanes and forgotten colonies. The journey was harsh, filled with danger, but Sir Call improved with each passing day. With modified support braces and neural stimulators, he began to walk short distances. It wasn't smooth, it was pain with every step, but he moved forward like a warrior who had never accepted defeat. The world had written him off. The system had called him finished. But James believed, and now Sir Call believed too. His broken body had been betrayed, abandoned, and nearly destroyed, but his will was untouched. And that will was now driving him back to strength, back to purpose. Deep down, James knew this wasn't the end. A storm was coming. Forces on both sides were angry, afraid of what these two represented: a bond that crossed species, duty, and protocol. But he also knew they had started something greater than a rescue. They had ignited a spark. And once Circle could walk again, once he could speak with his own voice, the universe would hear it, and they would no longer be ignored. The hidden facility, in the outer rings, was buried beneath a ruined mining colony, forgotten by most and ignored by the Coalition. It was the kind of place where old stories were swallowed by dust, and where the dead silence of history allowed new beginnings to grow. Circle and James arrived under cover of darkness, escorted by only a few trusted contacts. The base was barely functioning, old equipment sparked now and then, and the power grid needed constant maintenance, but it was safe, away from eyes that wanted Circle erased. Here, far from the politics of war and power, recovery became resistance. Every day, Circle pushed his body harder. The pain was constant, his limbs still untrustworthy, but he had learned to speak again, slowly and carefully, and his first clear words were not about revenge or glory, they were about unity. He told James, in a voice still rough from healing, that no single species could win this war alone. His people, proud and stubborn, had always believed in strength through isolation, but that path had led to destruction. Watching how James fought to protect him, even when all logic said to walk away, had changed something deep inside Circle. Now he saw the truth: if humans and Teloran could trust each other beyond orders and rank, they could build something that the enemy could never destroy. James understood, though he also knew what that meant. The enemy wasn't just the alien horde pressing the outer borders. It was also fear, deep within their own camps. Leaders who valued control over cooperation would never allow a symbol like Circle to stand. But the fire had already started. News had spread through quiet channels. Former soldiers, medics, engineers from both sides began appearing at the old base, some injured, some fugitives, all seeking something more than survival. They came with scraps of tech, stolen supplies, and a shared belief that maybe, just maybe, this broken place could become a new kind of force. Unity was forming, not through speeches or flags, but through quiet acts of courage. They called themselves the Ghost Cell. No government, no chain of command, just people who had seen too much and refused to stand down. Circle became their voice. James became their shield. Together, they started building more than weapons, they built trust. Teloran warriors trained beside human snipers. Mechanics combined alien shielding tech with human mobility suits. Even languages began blending, new words forming from shared effort. In the shadows, unity was growing into strength. But shadows don't last forever. One day, a stolen Coalition drone crashed just outside the base. Its memory core had been wiped, but the timing was too close to be a mistake. James and Circle knew what it meant: the enemy, or perhaps their own people, had found traces of their movement. A decision had been made. Some in the base wanted to scatter, to disappear before another war came to their door. But Circle stood before them, walking on legs still trembling, voice shaking but clear, and told them that running would only repeat history. He said, "We must not become ghosts. We must become the fire they fear." That speech, spoken in broken human language and alien growls, lit a spark in everyone's chest. They began preparing not to hide, but to be seen. James led the scouting teams, mapping safe corridors through forgotten tunnels. Circle coordinated defensive plans, teaching both sides how to fight as one. They built a beacon, not a weapon, but a signal, designed to reach every listening ear in space, carrying a simple message. Unity is possible, and it is rising. When the first wave came, it wasn't an invasion, it was sabotage. Someone had planted a virus in their systems, and half the base went dark during the key night cycle. Fires broke out in the med bay, alarms failed, and 2 guards vanished without a trace. Panic spread, but James and Circle responded with calm fury. They traced the breach, found a hidden transmitter in one of the cargo units, and discovered something worse than they expected. The signal wasn't from the enemy, but from within the coalition itself. Someone had branded them as traitors. Circle's survival was now a threat to balance, and James's protection of him had crossed a line no general wanted to admit existed.
The message was clear. They were not just fugitives, they were targets. Yet, instead of fear, the ghost cell found fire. They rebuilt systems using hybrid code. Engineers created a pulse wave to block further intrusions. And deep underground, Circle and James began shaping a plan not to escape, but to speak louder. If the galaxy would not listen to whispers, then they would roar. They prepared to broadcast their message across secure frequencies to show the footage of Circle's rescue, his healing, and the mixed unit training together. The world needed to see what had been born in the dark. But with that plan came danger. The moment the broadcast went live, they would become a threat too large to ignore. Fleets could be sent. Assassins could be deployed. The base might not survive the hour after the message. Still, no one hesitated. The day before the broadcast, James found Circle staring out over the cracked horizon, the sky above full of quiet stars. "Do you regret it?" James asked. The alien shook his head. "I was ready to die as a soldier," he said, "but now I am ready to live as something greater." That night, the message went live. It was not flashy or political. It simply showed truth footage of rescue, of pain, of unity in struggle. It ended with Circle standing beside James, both worn but unbroken, and his final words were spoken slowly. "We were enemies. We became brothers. If we can fight together, maybe peace is not a dream." Then the signal cut and the base fell silent. No one knew what would come next. Would the stars answer with missiles or with hope? But in the silence, a new strength settled in the hearts of everyone inside that old facility. They had stood in the shadows, not to hide, but to build a fire. And now, that fire had been seen. The silence after the broadcast was heavy, like the calm before a storm, and everyone inside the base waited with a strange mixture of fear and hope, unsure which would come first, destruction or response. For hours, there was nothing but static in the communication lines, and the skies remained quiet, the stars distant and cold. Circle stayed near the old signal tower, his legs weak but holding, his eyes watching the darkness for signs of light. James moved to the base like a man bracing for war, checking the gates, inspecting the weapons, speaking calmly to the fighters who were ready to die if the price of peace demanded it. They all knew the risks after showing the truth. They had made powerful enemies, the kind who ruled from behind curtains and feared unity more than war. But then, a message came not from an admiral or a spy, but from a cargo vessel orbiting a nearby moon. It was a small group of traders and medics, human and alien alike, who had seen the transmission and decided they would no longer be part of a divided galaxy. They asked for permission to land, not to take shelter, but to stand beside them. The ghost cell had become a beacon, and its light was beginning to reach even those who had given up hope. Soon, more messages followed. A Telorian scout group reported that they had mutinied refusing to bomb a civilian zone after watching Serkal's speech. A human rebel cell sent a video recording of their leader smashing the banner of isolation, saying they would rather stand with truth than hide behind lies. The broken base began to change, not just in numbers, but in purpose. Where once it was a hiding place for the wounded and the hunted, now it became a center of movement, a living symbol that enemies could become allies, that scars could become stories of strength. James watched it unfold with a strange feeling in his chest. He had never expected to lead anything, especially not a movement born from compassion. He had saved Serkal because it was right, not because he wanted a revolution. But the universe had different plans, and now people looked to him with respect, not as a soldier, but as someone who had made the impossible real. Serkal, too, changed. His speech improved, his body healed, and though he could not fight as he once had, he became something greater, a voice. He no longer needed armor or weapons to inspire others. His very survival, his decision to rise after being left to die, was enough to shake minds awake. Still, peace was not yet won. Intelligence reports warned them that a coalition strike force had been deployed officially. They were chasing pirates, but the pattern of movement said otherwise. They were coming for the ghost cell. The enemy wasn't coming in waves of monsters, but in silence, in the shape of former allies. James called a meeting with Serkal and the other leaders, human and alien, and they debated for hours. Some wanted to flee and scatter again to avoid the crushing power of an organized fleet. Others wanted to stand and fight to make one last statement with blood and flame. But Serkal surprised them all when he said they would do neither. He proposed something unheard of. They would send a diplomatic message, an invitation to meet the coalition's commander face to face. Many argued, said it was foolish, even suicidal. But James supported him. "We are not running," he said, "and we are not afraid. If we want peace, we must be willing to speak it, even in the face of guns." And so, the message was sent, an open channel, an offer for parley. The coalition's response came quickly. A single ship entered orbit, larger than any vessel the ghost cell had ever seen, but it did not fire. Instead, a small transport descended and landed just beyond the gates. Out stepped Commander Rylar, a man with steel eyes and metals that weighed more than his armor. He was known for crushing rebellions, for breaking spirits without firing a shot. But when he met James and saw Serkal standing unarmed beside him, something in his posture shifted. The meeting was tense. Rylar accused them of treason, of spreading dangerous ideas. Serkal replied that truth should never be a threat. James offered no defense, only a simple question: are you ready for another generation of war? For a moment, it seemed nothing would change. Then Rylar did the unexpected. He removed his gloves, stepped forward, and asked to see the training grounds. He walked among the humans and aliens training side by side. He watched a Loren teach a human child their traditional form of meditation. He listened to a mechanic explain how hybrid tech could improve both fleets without sacrifice. And slowly, the commander's eyes lost their hardness. Before he left, he said only one thing: "I will report what I've seen. And I will tell them the truth." No one knew what that meant. Perhaps they would still be attacked, crushed before the truth could spread. But they had done it. They had shown unity, not with force, but with honesty. Days passed. More ships arrived. Some brought aid. Some brought curious observers. One by one, Small outposts and planets began declaring support, not for war, but for the idea that peace was worth fighting for. The coalition didn't attack. Instead, an official order arrived. Sir Call was to be granted status as a diplomatic figure, protected under treaty law. James was offered reinstatement, though he declined. He had found his place. Together, they stood on the edge of history, no longer enemies, no longer shadows. They had proven that unity was possible, not through orders, but through choice. Across the galaxy, others began to follow. Some called it a miracle. Others called it rebellion. But one thing was clear: the line between enemy and ally had been broken. And in that space, something new was being born. The galaxy had begun to change, but peace never came easily, not when wounds still ran deep and powerful voices whispered from behind curtains, afraid of losing control. Even as more planets signed agreements to support cooperation between humans and T-Lorian, and the Ghost Cell evolved into a full Alliance hub, there were still those who wanted to silence the movement by any means necessary. Hidden factions, black ops teams, and shadow governments had not disappeared. They simply waited for the right moment. That moment came quietly, like a knife in the dark. It was just before dawn, when the alarms blared through the base, not from the sky, but from within. Someone had breached the security core. James was already on his feet when the power cut for 3 seconds, long enough to open doors that should have stayed locked. He and Circle raced through the corridors, calling out orders, trying to contain the breach, but they were too late to stop the explosion in the command wing. The blast shook the ground and sent fire through the eastern wall, and though the fire teams responded quickly, it was clear this was not an accident. Amid the wreckage, they found signs of infiltration, cloaked tech, remote drones, and traces of human DNA. Whoever did it knew the layout perfectly and had come for a single purpose: to break the heart of the Alliance. James survived the blast, but his injuries were severe. He was pulled from the rubble with broken ribs, a damaged lung, and blood soaking into his uniform, still clutching his pulse pistol as if he had been ready to fight even while unconscious. The medics worked without sleep, stabilizing him in the lower wing, while the leadership scrambled to protect the base from further attack. Sir Call sat by his side, watching the machines breathe for the man who had once carried him from the battlefield. Word of the attack spread fast. Some feared the Alliance would fall apart now that its human symbol was fading. Pilots flew in with medical supplies. Volunteers arrived from far systems, offering to defend the base until reinforcements came.
The entire base fell into silence as the news spread. No one spoke for a long time. Even the ships in orbit dimmed their lights in mourning. A ceremony was held at sunrise. Circle stood before thousands of humans and aliens gathered in the open yard, his voice steady but his eyes clouded. He told the story of the human who had done what others would not. The soldier who saved an enemy and changed the future. He spoke of James not as a legend, but as a man who had made a choice that others now had to carry forward. There were no grand banners, no fireworks, no anthem of victory. Just the rising sun and a silence filled with memory. His body was not sent to Earth or buried on T-Lorian. It was placed at the heart of the Ghost Cell, beneath the old comms tower where Circle had once stood and asked for help. A monument was built there, not tall or shining, but made from pieces of wreckage, stone, and metal from every world that now stood united. On it were simple words: he chose to save. Months passed, and the Alliance grew. Though attacks still came, they were fewer now, and the voices of peace grew louder. Treaties were signed, Old enemies sat at the same table, and the name of James Trenton became more than a story, it became a symbol in classrooms, on recruitment posters, in whispered prayers across war-torn colonies. Circle took the role of ambassador, traveling across systems to speak not of victory, but of understanding. Every speech began with the same line, "I was the enemy. He chose to save me." His voice reached places James had never seen, and his message changed minds before bullets could. One day, during a summit on New Corinth, a young human soldier approached Circle and saluted, not with military formality, but with quiet respect. "My brother served with him," the boy said, eyes bright.